What do climate change and coronavirus have in common? It turns out they have a lot in common. I've been thinking about it and I have come up with at least 6 or 7 different things that they have in common. Starting with the most obvious one. The most obvious one is simply that they both begin with C. Yes. But pretty soon we get to some others. Like what? Well, like the fact that we have had early warnings on both of them. So it was 1965. So this headline is actually old. It's 55 years ago, not 50 years. 55 years ago, scientists first warned a US president of the dangers of climate change. And experts have been warning the US government of the impacts of a pandemic for a very long time. In fact, it turns out that we get a global pandemic about every 30 years. We get the bird flu, remember that? The swine flu. The Spanish flu was 100 years ago. But about every 30 years, give or take, we get a pandemic. Now, what's the difference? Why is this one so much worse than any one that we've had since the 1920s? It's so much worse because it's so infectious. The other ones that we had before were not so infectious, so they didn't spread so widely around the world, but they were still very serious. If you remember SARS, especially if you were in Asia, I think I was living in Toronto at that time, and we had some cases even in Toronto at that time too that led to schools being closed down. So we had been warned that there was a pandemic coming. That was a certainty, not a guess. Just when it would come and how virulent it would be were the only uncertainties. And there was even a warning specifically about COVID back a very long time ago. In January, world markets were being warned about coronavirus. Not only that, but a lot of people have known about this. So there is a project called Exxon New, and Mackenzie, if you could put a link to that in the chat so you can learn more about that if you're interested. There's a project called Exxon New that actually looks at how much Exxon knew about climate change. And it turns out they knew a lot about climate change. In fact, the memos that they were writing back in the 1970s look like scientific reports that were being published in the 1990s. There was a brand new study that just came out yesterday. This is from yesterday, talking about how Ford and General Motors also knew. It turned out that they actually had scientists studying climate change. This was unearthed by a reporter, Maxine Josselot, and found, for example, that in 1956, go to the bottom here, in 1956, a Ford scientist called Gilbert Plass rejected the idea that excess warming from burning fossil fuels poses, quote, little danger to the earth. Instead, he said, no, burning all of the fossil fuels that we know that we have would raise global temperatures by about 7 degrees Celsius. And he was right. He said this back in 1956. And with the pandemic, there's even evidence that shows that the former administration left a pandemic game plan for this administration. They didn't know coronavirus specifically was coming. They're not psychic, but they left a game plan. Literally, what do you do if a pandemic comes to the US? And what do you think happened to that? Nothing. In fact, here's a quote down here from Mitch McConnell. When discussing pandemic preparedness, he said, clearly the Obama administration did not leave any kind of game plan for something like this. And the PolitiFact Truthometer rates that a pants on fire. In the same way, Exxon took out these whole page ads in the Wall Street Journal saying, oh, climate change is no big deal. And it turns out that according to their own scientists, that is also a pants on fire. I was even on a webinar earlier this year in May, and Mackenzie has a link to that webinar that she can drop in the chat there. It's recorded and it's on YouTube. Contrary to what you may look, how it may look from this picture, everybody was awake, not just the two of us on the bottom. But this was a really great webinar that we did with the New York University Journalism Institute, where they had Ron Klain, who was the, quote, Ebola czar for the Obama administration, who handled the Ebola response. and they had me on, and we were talking about the synergies between pandemics and climate change. So if you really want to know more about what the previous administration knew and did about pandemics, this is a great webinar to check out, because you'll hear directly from Ron about what he learned from working with Ebola and how that applies to the situation that we're in today. But even though we had all of these warnings, we thought that they were distant. So for example, here's a news story from January 2020. So this is, just 10 months ago. It says pneumonia of unknown cause in China, detected in Wuhan. It doesn't say global pandemic about to start or crash over your head. It simply says there is a pneumonia of unknown cause. So if you read this headline, would this make you worried? Probably not. You think, okay, it's in Wuhan. I've never been there. And it's pneumonia that, people get pneumonia. It's 44 people in a very large country like China. So we just think it's a distant issue. It's far away. And as you know, if you've heard me talk about climate change, we have the exact same problem about climate change too, right? So if you ask people, is global warming happening? Most people will say yes. If you ask people, is it going to harm plants and animals? Most people, again, will say yes. You say, will it harm future generations? Most people say yes. Will it harm people in developing countries? Oh, a little bit less, but still, mostly yes. Will it harm people in the US? Ooh, now we start to see some blue. It's not just orange, a little bit less. And then you ask people, is it going to harm you? All of a sudden, it's blue. It's the same problem. We don't think it matters to us. Why? Because again, we think it's a polar bear issue. Or in the case of coronavirus, we think it's a Wuhan issue. We don't think it's an issue for us here and now. This is something that social scientists call psychological distance. Specifically, we think that something is abstract and formless rather than concrete. We think it's far away in time, way in the future, not now. Or we think it's far away in space, not here. Or we think it's far away in terms of its relevance to us. It doesn't matter to me, it just matters to those other people. So because of that, even when we're warned, we don't take the warning seriously because we don't think it matters. It's like somebody warning you of, killer hornets, right? Or murder hornets is what they're called. They're warning you about murder hornets. And you're like, there's no murder hornets here. Why should I even pay attention to that? And then it turns out you've got a nest of them under your deck. That's the type of situation that we were in with coronavirus and with climate change. In fact, you may know some people, and I do too, who had a pneumonia in February or March. And some of them, even like my cousin, had to go to the hospital for that pneumonia and were very sick. I was just talking to one person who was incredibly sick, living right here in the US in early March, and they weren't testing for coronavirus then, but he went and got tested for antibodies after he recovered. And it turns out he had lots of antibodies. So chances are he had it. So people had it right here before we were even worried about it, before we were shutting down. And in fact, the first week in March, I was packing to go to Ireland. When I travel, I add up all of my invitations, and I only travel when I have a critical mass of invitations in one place. So I'd been collecting invitations from Ireland for 2 years. We had finally organized 18 different events in 11 days across every major city and university in Ireland, just about. And actually, fun fact, I'm doing one of the canceled ones this Thursday, and it's going to be virtual. So if you actually want to tune into my Irish lecture on Thursday afternoon, you can do that. How do you find it? You go to my Facebook page. Mackenzie, if you don't mind putting a link to my Facebook page, which is just my name, Katharine Hayhoe, put a link to that in the chat. And then if you go there, you can see all my events, including the Irish talk that was canceled that I'm giving on Thursday. But I was packing my bags the beginning of March to go to Ireland, and my husband said, I've been hearing about this new virus. Do you think you should go to Ireland? And I lived through SARS, and swine flu too. And I thought, well, what's the big deal? Sure. I don't think it's going to affect us. So famous last words, off I go to Ireland. I actually got half my talks done. That actually did happen. And then in a 24-hour period, the entire country shut down. And I just made it out before they had a lockdown so severe that you couldn't travel more than 2 kilometers from your home without, being arrested. So thankfully I made it home before that, but that just goes to show it was even psychologically distant for me, let alone for other people. But in fact, both climate change and coronavirus are public health issues. Now, it's obvious that coronavirus is a public health issue, right? But climate change is also a public health issue. In fact, climate change fundamentally affects our health, and that's why we care. It affects our health directly through bigger heat waves that increase people's risk, especially people who can't afford air conditioning or people who already have respiratory diseases. But what about inhalation from wildfire smoke as climate change makes bigger and bigger wildfires? What about the health impacts of stronger, bigger hurricanes as more area is flooded? And then all the pollution that happens as a result of that, and the mold that grows in people's basements, and the people that are actually harmed or even killed by the severe weather. What about the mental health impact of climate change, which is very real? What about the tropical diseases that are spreading northward right through Texas, like dengue and Zika and chikungunya? And what about the water pollution from the increased heavy rainfall? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us. So there's more flooding, and more flooding means more water pollution, and more water pollution means more health impacts, even right here in the US, as well as, of course, obviously in developing countries. So we care about climate change and we care about coronavirus for the same reasons. They both affect our health, all of us, no matter who we are or where we live. Not only that, but climate change is caused primarily by burning fossil fuels, and burning fossil fuels is also responsible for what? Air pollution. Now, air pollution and the heat trapping gases that cause climate change are not the same thing. When you burn coal, it produces air pollution that's dirty and you see it in the air and it produces smog. Or the tailpipe emissions from your car produce smog. That's air pollution. Air pollution only lasts for a few days to a few weeks, but it damages your lungs when you breathe it in so badly that air pollution is responsible for almost 9 million deaths around the entire world worldwide, and over 200 deaths every year in the US. Now, US COVID deaths have just topped 200,000 this year. So well over 200,000 lives have been lost from coronavirus this year. And that is horrifying. But did you know that air pollution kills 200,000 people in the US every year? Every year. It's the silent killer. And not only that, but burning fossil fuels also produce the heat trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane that cause climate change. These gases last for decades to centuries in the atmosphere. And as the world warms up, here's the connection, the chemical reactions that create the air pollution from our tailpipe emissions happen faster. So the warmer it is, the more air pollution you get. It's this vicious circle. And that's not all. Both climate change and coronavirus are devastating the economy, not in the future, today. It's really hard to put a number on the coronavirus pandemic. This number changes every day. As of last month, it was estimated that coronavirus would shrink the US economy by about $8 trillion. But you think the COVID catastrophe is expensive. The climate catastrophe could cost $1 quadrillion. If we stick to the Paris Agreement, the global economy would grow by 336 trillion in the next 80 years. But if we don't, it could shrink by 60 trillion. Doesn't that blow you away? They're both economic issues too. And taking them seriously actually makes sense. Here's one of the saddest things about them, though, that they both have in common. And that is that both climate change and coronavirus highlight the pre-existing injustices and inequalities that we have in our society, and they increase the vulnerability of people who are already vulnerable. Let's go back to air pollution for a minute. Remember how I talked about how burning fossil fuels creates air pollution? Who primarily breathes in that air pollution? People who can't afford to live in a better neighborhood. People who can't afford to live somewhere that's next to a place that burns, a factory or a coal-fired power plant or a place where there's lots of pollution. So people in poor neighborhoods here in the US already breathe more air pollution in, and they already have greater impacts on their lungs because of it. So now let's connect this to coronavirus. It turns out that if you have been exposed to air pollution for a long time, then you are much more likely to catch COVID if you're exposed to the virus, and you are much more likely to get seriously ill and even die of COVID than if you had healthy lungs that were not exposed to air pollution on a regular basis. So, for example, in the city of Chicago, about 30% of the population is Black, but 70% of the deaths are among the Black community from COVID. What do they think is the connection? They suspect the connection is air pollution. Now, we know that climate change is also increasing inequalities. One Stanford study last year estimated that climate change has increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries by 25% already. It's already increased the distance between the haves and the have-nots. And we see the same thing happening with coronavirus. According to the United Nations, as of last month, they said COVID could fuel more conflict, more poverty, more starvation. It is pushing millions of more children deeper into poverty. And when you look at that picture of those shoes, doesn't that just break your heart? It just makes you want to just, buy a whole box full of shoes for any poor child who needs them. And if you want to donate to organizations, there are plenty of great organizations you can donate to that are helping people who are already crushed by poverty, who are being disproportionately affected by climate change. So please do that. They need your help. But with climate change, we see the same thing happening. Climate change disproportionately affects women, especially in developing countries. It disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples who have already had so much taken away from them. And it disproportionately affects people of color, people who are poor, people who are living in neighborhoods that are right next to hazardous waste dumps or landfills or chemical factories, places that are producing hazardous fumes or air pollution. It's all part of the same vicious cycle. But we also see this that they have in common. When we feel threatened by climate change action or coronavirus action, when we feel threatened by the idea that we need to do something about climate change, or we feel threatened by the idea somehow that putting a mask on violates our freedom, what do? We react with myths and disinformation. Disinformation about coronavirus is endemic. Fake cures, false information about vaccines, people telling other people not to take vaccines, all kinds of disinformation about masks. It is rampant on social media. And you know what? The myths about climate change are too. In fact, what I have found, and studies have backed this up, this is a study that just came out yesterday. Studies have backed this up, that climate change disinformation and coronavirus disinformation often comes from the same sources. I don't know if you heard about something called a Great Barrington Declaration, which is basically saying open up the whole country and just, let herd immunity run its course. Well, it turns out that it was not such a grassroots petition as you might think. It was actually crafted by an organization that's also known for climate denial. The two go hand in hand. What does coronavirus denial have in common with climate denial? On the surface of it, nothing. But what it does is it implies we have to do something to fix it. And many people would rather literally cut off their arm than do anything to fix these problems. So this is the problem that we have. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. I don't know if you've seen it, but I think it is perfect. So here we have the doctors and the medical experts on coronavirus. And they say, as long as we just provide the facts to the American people, surely that will be enough. And then over there, you've got the climate scientists killing themselves laughing because we know that that is not the way it works. In fact, my second most popular global weirding episode, and if you're not familiar with global weirding, please do check it out. Mackenzie's going to put a link in the chat right now. The web address is just globalweirdingseries.com. So our second most popular global weirding episode actually talks specifically about this myth. If I just explain the facts, surely they'll get it. And the answer is no, they won't. Why not? Because it isn't the facts they have a problem with. It's the perceived solutions. So the interesting thing, though, is that whether you agree with the solutions or not, you're still affected by it. So in this book, Merchants of Doubt, which is an excellent book if you haven't read it, we actually hosted a viewing of this movie in the Alamo back in the good old days when we could actually do movie club in person. It describes how Exxon knew about climate change and how it deliberately covered it up. You can watch this documentary or you can read the book, either one. Both of them are excellent. It's by Naomi Oreskes, and don't forget her name because I'm going to mention her again here. But look at the headline that we saw a couple of years ago. The same oil companies that actually invested large amounts of money in publishing disinformation about climate change, they want federal dollars to protect them from what? From the flooding due to sea level rise. Why is sea level rising? Climate change. Why is climate changing? 75% of the problem is emissions from burning fossil fuels. So whether you say it's happening or not, it doesn't matter. It still affects you. And in the same way with coronavirus, the WHO warned about coronavirus early and often. Yet a study a couple of weeks ago from Cornell University found that 38% of the misinformation being circulated on social media originated with one person who had been explicitly warned by the WHO, the World Health Organization, for many months. This same person, President Trump, also shares disinformation about climate change. Now, I want to be very clear with you. I am not telling anyone how to vote. That's inappropriate. But what I can do as a scientist is I can fact check. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk you through a fact check of the president's recent interview with Lesley Stahl. This is an excerpt of it. And so Lesley Stahl begins by saying, I wish you could go to Greenland to watch those huge chunks of ice just falling into the ocean, raising sea level. And in fact, Lesley has been to Greenland. And if you watch the Years of Living Dangerously, I believe it's episode 3 or 4, where you can actually see Lesley in Greenland and see what's happening in Greenland. So the president says, you don't know whether or not this would have happened with or without man. Well, we do. And in fact, we have a global weirding episode about it. We have carefully checked every single source of natural climate variations, the sun, volcanoes, natural cycles, orbital cycles, even things we don't know about. And we know that it is happening for one reason only, and that is because of humans. Not just man, women are very involved as well, unfortunately. So then he says, we have scientists who disagree with that. Well, studies into the scientific agreement on human-caused global warming find that between 91 to 100%, and there you see Naomi Oreskes' name again, 91 to 100% of scientists agree that it is human-caused. And in fact, what we did a few years ago was we took the 38 studies that had been published in the last 10 years, 38 studies that either said that climate wasn't changing or humans weren't responsible, and we reanalyzed them from scratch. And you know what we found? We found an error, at least one, sometimes multiple errors, in each one. That if you corrected that error, you brought the results right into line with the thousands of other papers that have been published in the last decade and the last century and more, showing that yes, climate is changing and indeed humans are responsible. So in the US, there's literally 5 scientists, I can count them on the fingers of one hand, with degrees in a field relevant to climate science, who say that they don't say that climate isn't changing, and I don't think any of them say that humans aren't responsible. Today, they mostly just say, oh, it's not only humans, or it's not a big deal, or it's too expensive to do anything about it. There's still only 5 of those, but there's nobody who says that climate isn't changing who has any scientific leg to stand on whatsoever. So then they went on to talk about hurricanes. And the president said, they say we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael. Now, here's the thing. We are not seeing a change in the number of hurricanes, but we are definitely, without any question whatsoever, seeing bigger, stronger hurricanes fueled by what? A warming ocean. Why is the ocean warming? Because of all the heat trapping gases that we're putting into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. And you won't be surprised, we have a global weirding episode for that too. So last but not least, at the very bottom, we have Leslie says, what about the scientists who say it's worse than ever? And this is what the president says. He says, show me the scientists. Well, there were 400 scientists who wrote the 4th US national assessment that was published under the Trump administration. 2,000 pages written by 400 scientists, making it very clear that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and the time to act is now. So the president was shown the scientists. Why didn't he listen to them? It isn't because he truly doesn't believe in science. Most people do believe in science. We have a problem with the solutions. But if we know something is real and bad, but we don't want to fix it, that makes us a bad person to say that. So and I mean this genuinely, our collective instinctive human response when we are faced with any situation that we don't want to fix is to reject the reality of the problem in the first place. That is our natural human response. But we know that bad things happen. One of my favorite March for Science signs, at the start of every disaster movie, there is a scientist being ignored. Yes, because science is real. A thermometer doesn't give us a different answer depending on how we vote. Just like gravity is real, we know that the climate is changing and humans are responsible. So in Merchants of Doubt, which I talked about before, Naomi Oreskes lays out all of the different approaches that people have taken to muddy the waters and confuse us on climate change. But Naomi has a new book, and her new book is called Why Trust Science. She also has an excellent TED Talk of the same name, because in February, we have Naomi coming to speak to us. We are doing 2 live book discussions every semester, and Naomi is kicking off our first book discussion in February 2021 on why trust science. So get yourself a copy of this book, start giving it a read, join us in February because she will be digging more into this question of why should we trust science? And she has some great thoughts. Her TED Talk is also excellent. So, but if it isn't really about rejecting the science, what is it really about? Well, the debate the other day, the presidential debate, showed what it's really about. What it's really about is rejecting the solutions. So, for example, during the debate, when asked about how are you going to fix climate change, which is exactly the right question, no debate moderator should ever be asking, do you believe in climate change as if it's a religion? The question is, how are you going to fix it? The president talked about tiny windows and basically was poo-pooing efficiency because he said, oh, it'll just make your houses with these tiny windows. Well, if you go and you look at passive houses online, these are the types of pictures you end up with. I don't know about you, but I don't see a lot of tiny windows in passive houses these days. You can do it yourself. If you go to Google and you type in passive house and then you click on images, just look at all the images you get and how many of those have tiny windows? Hardly any. So why is he saying this? Why is, and this just came out yesterday too, yesterday was apparently a bonanza day for new studies. A new study showed that this current administration has buried dozens of clean energy studies that taxpayer reports or taxpayer money paid for. And then during the debate, the president also poo-pooed wind energy. He said that wind energy was responsible for too many bird deaths. Now, wind energy is responsible for bird deaths. That is true. And I'm very excited about research that is looking at how to reduce that. Here's a couple of cool ways they're looking at how to reduce it. Number one, the easiest way is to paint the turbines. If they're not white, it turns out that they actually avert birds and bats, which is even more important than birds, if they're painted a different color. Unfortunately, purple seems to be one of the colors that turn bats off. I don't know about you, but purple wind turbines aren't too attractive, but they're also looking at other colors too. Number two, it turns out that you can actually put wind turbines on a floating platform that's tethered to the ground. So when it's time to replace the turbine, you replace it with something that floats, it's tethered to the ground, and it can go a lot higher up where the wind is a lot faster. So you get more power out of each turbine, and there's not hardly any, if any, birds up there because you're up so much higher. And then third, they've created a new type of turbine that doesn't have a blade that goes around, it just vibrates like this. And then fourth, they've even looked at if you just switch off the turbines right at dawn and dusk when all the bats are going around, you just switch them off briefly for that time period, you can almost completely eliminate the deaths. So anyways, there's lots of things you can do to eliminate bird and bat deaths from wind energy, and we should be doing them because especially, and we should not be locating turbines on migratory flyways either. But just look at this figure here. If you were genuinely concerned about bird deaths, if that was something you're genuinely concerned about, and you should be, why not? Because birds are a really important part of our ecosystem. If looking at this figure, what's the number one thing that you would consider doing? I would recommend spaying cats. Yes, spaying feral cats to reduce feral cat populations would probably be the number one thing that I would advocate if I was genuinely concerned about birds. What else would I be concerned about? I would be concerned about building windows, putting things on the outside of windows so that birds didn't fly into them. I would be concerned about pesticide poisoning. I would be concerned about fossil fuels because it turns out fossil fuels kill, count them, almost 1,000 times, 3 times more birds than wind energy. I would be concerned about communication towers. I would be concerned about farm equipment. You've even got some contribution from nuclear power. If you're concerned about birds, there's a lot of other things that you could do. And you will not be surprised to learn that we have a global weirding episode about that too. Yes, it talks about that. Because the reality is that wind energy is a huge source of energy and revenue for Texas. Did you know that here in Texas, we already get 20% of our electricity from wind? And in fact, here's the cool thing. If you wanted to supply the whole world with solar energy from the Sahara Desert, now don't get me wrong, the transmission would be somewhat difficult, so we don't really want to do that. But if you did want to supply the entire world, the red square at the top, make it a little bit bigger because that number is 15 years old. The red square at the top is the square we would need. What would it look like for the US? If you built a solar farm in West Texas to supply the entire United States with electricity, how big would it have to be? I calculated it by hand, and this is even just leaving wind out, only solar, and that's how big it would have to be. Not all of the way between Lubbock and Amarillo. For reference, and this is from Twitter, people worry about how much land we need to supply the US with clean energy. It turns out it's roughly comparable to the area we currently use to grow maple syrup or golf. Now, don't get me wrong, I love maple syrup, and I do play golf too. But we're not talking about crazy amounts of area. And in fact, if you zoom in on this very cool map, isn't this a cool map? If you zoom on this cool map, you can see how we actually use our land. Most of it's used for cows. We've also got a lot for livestock feed. In fact, the area for livestock feed is more than twice as big as the area for food that we eat. Now look for what we use for maple syrup. It's right up there, kind of in the Great Lakes there, right by Indiana and Ohio, that's maple syrup. What about golf? Look down in the Carolinas. In South Carolina, you can see that little golf area there. And then you can see cotton down at the bottom. You can see wetlands and desert. You can see the 100 largest landowning families would basically own Florida all by themselves. This is how we use our land. Land is not a problem. And I was delighted when Elon Musk actually replied, and he said, good analysis, although slightly conservative in my opinion. However, using a high upper bound for land area, that's still a tiny percentage of the US. Hopefully, it would help to convert some naysayers. That giant fusion reactor in the sky that we call the sun produces a truly staggering amount of energy. It does. So, how does this relate to coronavirus? Well, it turns out that many countries around the world are taking the pandemic recovery as an opportunity to develop green energy and green infrastructure. Even here in the US, the fastest growing job for the last 5 years, according to the Bureau of Labor, has been either in the solar or wind energy. They trade off year to year. Around the world, they're doing things like in Canada, requiring corporations to have a climate plan before they get government bailouts. Air companies like Air France are required to cut their carbon emissions 50% in order to get a government bailout. Green jobs are huge. In fact, India already leads the world in green jobs. Did you know that? India has more green jobs than any other country. But other countries are taking the opportunity of the recovery to catch up. So, coronavirus and climate change really are connected, not just in the problems, not just in how we respond to them, but also in the solutions. And that is why, when it comes to both coronavirus recovery and climate change, it is so important to talk about how we can fix it. In fact, if there's only one thing we can talk about, that's what I would pick: how we can fix it. Because how we can fix it is good news. In fact, how we can fix it is great news. And so when I met Andreas, the author of Climate Courage, when I met him a year ago when I was visiting California, he came up and he told me about this book he was writing, Climate Courage: How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Community, Transform the Economy, and Bridge the Political Divide. And I said, Andreas, that sounds like just the book we need. That is exactly the book that everybody should read to understand how fantastic this is and what a difference climate solutions can make for all of us. So Andreas said to me, he said, well, would you be willing to write the foreword of the book? So I said, okay, I can do that. So I wrote the foreword to his book. He wrote the book. It is an easy read. It is a positive read. It's an encouraging read. If you need good news, this is a good news book. And the even better news is that we have Andreas coming to speak to us at our next book discussion on Thursday, November 19th at 5 p.m. Mackenzie, if you have a link to that event, if you could drop that in the chat for people so they could make sure that they have that information. You don't want to miss this. Now, you don't have to read the book to come. It's good if you do read the book, but you don't have to. But if you do read the book, you will enjoy it and you will feel positive and uplifted. And who doesn't need a little bit of hope these days? So the last and most important thing to talk about when it comes to both coronavirus recovery and climate change is how there are positive, constructive solutions that take care of a lot of our inequalities, a lot of our economic problems, a lot of the marginalization and injustice we have in our society, and they clean up our air, they clean up our water, they grow the economy, they build local jobs, and those solutions are all good for us. And that is the last and most important thing that COVID and climate change share. Thank you.